Writing for a First Cause, Philosophy Portal's fourth anthology, is now available. To pick up a copy, visit philosophyportal.online. Welcome to another philosophical conversation. My name's Cadell Last, and I'm here today with Todd McGowan, who, if you followed Philosophy Portal's channel, has been a regular guest over the years. We've discussed his previous works, Emancipation After Hegel, as well as The Racist Fantasy, and he's also taught at Philosophy Portal for a course on the Acree, which is actually titled Useless Excesses in the course itself, which I think will give us a window into the material we'll be covering today, namely one of his more recent books, Pure Excess. So let's get into that. I mean, right off the bat, probably people will be thinking about Todd McGowan and the LAC conference, and then, what is the relationship here between focusing on lack and focusing on excess? And I think that in the introduction of your book, this is really something that strikes me as one of the core points you're trying to get at is how do we think the relationship between lack and excess?
Right. That's exactly right. That I think that one of the things that I talk about in terms of capitalism is that it divides those two things totally. So you're either lacking or you're excessive, and you experience yourself as lacking, and you try to overcome that by attaining what I say in the title is pure excess. And so that dream of pure excess is, I think, endemic, inherent, and intrinsic to the capitalist system. And I think that's the wager of the book, is that that's the real damage that it does psychically, is that it separates excess from lack. And so part of the thing that I think, one of the things that draws me to psychoanalysis is the way that it sees that how our status as a lacking subject is integral to our ability to be excessive. So it's only because we're lacking that we're capable of these incredible ecstatic excesses. And so if you divide those two, if you fail to see the connection between them, then I think you end up with a more oppressive system.
I think that one of the obviously key links here between lack and excess is that it is being used to analyze capitalism specifically as a system, as a socioeconomic paradigm, as even let's say a weird interpretation or a false interpretation of modernity, where capitalism is promising this pure excess, almost like it's almost like pulling the heavens down into a secular interpretation. And so this fantasy of pure excess, do you see this as fundamentally linked to the commodity form?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, Cadell. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is the promise. I originally wanted to title the book subtitle it Capitalism in the Commodity Form, but Columbia said, we don't like that. Commodity form, it's too abstract or whatever. People know what that means. But I thought, to me, Marx has his own definition of the commodity form. To me, the definition of the commodity form is precisely that it contains this promise of pure excess in it, both for, so what's kind of interesting, both for the producer and for the consumer. So obviously for Marx, the more of the focus is on production, obviously, but for me, it's equally on the side of the consumer, that you buy something and you look to it as a site where you're going to attain some kind of pure excess without any lack. And I give a lot of examples of this, like the new car smell when you're driving the car off the lot, or when you first pick up a baked good at the new bakery, or so whatever it is. Like, it has this sense of a pure excess to it. And then when you take the first bite, that's lost. When you drive the car off the lot, that's lost. So that's so I think it is, I almost would say the definition of the commodity form is the promise of pure excess. That's how I would put it. So it's totally linked to the commodity form.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely remember becoming hooked into commodities and associating a kind of overcoming of an unconscious lack when I was a teenager, and then more and more moved into forms of minimalism, moved into sort of a withdrawal from the commodity form. And of course, this movement itself kind of helps you see the oscillation between lack and excess. And I take it to be the thesis of your book that you're trying to help us not get rid of excess, not get rid of lack, but see them in some sort of fundamental unity, and that might open up a new way of thinking about our relationship to capitalism or even overcoming capitalism.
Yeah, one or the other. Yeah, I think you put it exactly how I would put it. That we, if we can see the dialectical connection between lack and excess, then I think that changes our relationship. It makes us. I think if you see that, then you're not a capitalist subject. Now, of course, you still live within capitalist society, but I think it makes you less susceptible to the inducements of capitalist society. And then does it pave the way for something else? Maybe. I mean, I think hopefully what that might be today, it's hard to say. It seems like we're headed from capitalism to something far worse. But I do actually talk about that in the book, like this fascistic tendency of that capitalism in a way inherently leads to the fascist turn that I think we're seeing today. So I do think that's part of this, because of the dissatisfaction, because you never attain that pure excess, then that produces this yearning for something that's going to really tell you why you're not getting it, right? And that, I think that's what the fascist does. But back to your point, I think, yeah, that's the key to creating an alternative, is to seeing the connection. So it's not just saying, oh, I'm going to just abandon everything and become a figure of pure lack like a monk. Instead, it's I'm going to see the connection between, and I think it's true about not just the things within capitalism, but I think it's true about everything in life, like the way in which some of our worst qualities are also tied to the things that are best about us, right? Like you can't really, if you take away someone's worst things, then you lose their best things as well, right? And I think that's a really important realization.
Well, it's an interesting point about the just the commentary on becoming something like a monk, and I think that's interesting to think about in the context of the last 10 years, last 15 years. There have been a lot of people turning to things like Western Buddhism,
Yeah.
and just this idea maybe that the turn to Buddhism or the appeal of Buddhism today could be itself a symptom of capitalism, like people sort of maybe overwhelmed by the excess of capitalism and then turning to a non-dialectical lack, kind of pure withdrawal from the commodity form, or something
No,
like
I
that.
think I think it's absolutely right. I think it's absolutely right. And I think that's why Slavoj Žižek is so critical of Western Buddhism, right? To a lot of, he gets a lot of criticism for his critique. But I think the reason he is
Yeah.
because it fits well with the capitalist structure. And what's interesting, I mean, his point more is that it allows someone to then go on and be excessive because they've taken care of their lack in this other area. But I think it's more what you're saying. I think it's more this, I'm bombarded with this imperative to be purely excessive, and so here's a solution to that problem. I can retreat into the pure lack of a certain kind of Western Buddhism. I got to be careful because one of my colleagues, Hyunju Yu, she's a Korean Buddhist, and whenever I make sweeping statements about Buddhism, she comes down on me. So I want to be clear that I'm talking about Western certain kind of Buddhism. But
Yeah.
her idea is that Buddhism and psychoanalysis are totally the same. But
Ah.
but I think that is certainly the way that it functions within capitalism. Exactly what you're talking about.
I mean, it is a fascinating intersection. I'm super biased, even though I have explored some facets of Buddhism, that I think there is a key difference between psychoanalysis and Buddhism, probably on the level of the death drive. But at the same time thinking about so many people I've met who, very successful businessmen, made millions of dollars, and you meet them at these Buddhist retreats, and they're looking to get away from it. They're looking for some way to
Yeah.
get out of it. So I mean, even, you talk about in the book how the capitalist subject can never stop accumulating. It's never actually enough. And having the phenomenology of someone who's accumulated what some people might assume would get rid of this accumulation, say, I've made $1 million, now I can stop. They can't.
They
They
can't.
can't. They're
Right.
they're
Right.
caught in this circuit,
Right.
and it never feels like enough. And they always. It's even remarkable encountering someone who, again, you assume someone who's made $1 million would feel strong or feel powerful, but oftentimes they don't feel like that.
I know. It's crazy. I feel richer. I've met some really wealthy people and they feel poorer to themselves than I feel about myself. So it's really kind of a
Yeah,
crazy thing. And I think it's really, I mean, it's almost a cliche that the more you have, the more you feel like you need. But I think that's really true. I mean, I think that's how that logic of pure excess functions. And I think it's almost impossible. It's interesting, the Buddhist retreat as a way to try to get out of that, right? But I think it's really, when you're, as long as you're in that position, it's almost impossible to get out of it. I think like you can't, it's, because you retreat, but you're still, you're going to the retreat and you're retreating, but you're still in that psychic position and you're going to always come back to it. And so that seems to me the fundamental problem. And it's just a fascinating, I mean, it's a crazy kind of system, right? Because if you can, if you just think back in human history, the system, that they didn't function like that. Like the aristocrats were just, they thought that they had plenty, they were fine, right? The idea that they needed more would have been, I think, it would have been it's funny. I was on this, I've talked about this quite a bit. I was on this, someone made a mistake and saw that I wrote a book on capitalism and desire. And he ran a podcast, a pro-capitalist podcast, and he thought I would be a good guest. And I explained to him, you don't want me on your show. And he said, no, I'm open. Come on, just come on to my podcast. And one of the things was really fascinating. And so he was fine. I mean, it was, we didn't have any common ground whatsoever, but he wasn't mean. And one of the things that was really fascinating was he said, throughout human history, people have always wanted more. Like that's a fact of all of human history. And then he gave the example of Plato's allegory of the cave, and that the philosopher goes down and shows people that up above there's gold to be had, and that's why they're coming up. And I'm like, that's the worst reading of Plato's allegory of the cave I've ever come across. And so finally I said, can we just have a truce, and we'll give you Adam Smith and David Ricardo and Ayn Rand, but we get to keep Plato on our side, because you can't form him into a capitalist, a vent la lettre. So, but he didn't agree to that. And I said, if you read the rest of the Republic, it's a kind of communist book, right? And he didn't comment on that. So, but I thought it was really funny. And I think that's part of the belief system, is that it's always, it's written into human physiology, right?
right.
That desire for more. So there's no way to really, you have to try to discipline yourself through
Mhm.
some kind of monkishness, but there's really no way to get around it.
I guess the desire for more, like in a Platonic conception, like for example, you'd say that uh, like Christianity is Plato for the masses. You have this
Right.
idea that we strive for, either it's the ideal forms or heaven, some notion of an afterlife. My interpretation has always been that in pre-modern society, we wanted something more, but we never thought it was achievable on this earth. And so we put it into the afterlife. Whereas in modernity, it gets pulled down and we start speculating and hypothesizing about ways in which it could be achieved here, where the something
Right.
more is secularized, like what is it called, the uh, imminent eschaton or something like that.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
there's
yeah,
a
yeah,
immanentization of
yeah,
the eschaton.
yeah.
What do you think of that? Is that
No, I think it's great. I think it's great.
yeah?
Just to clarify for people listening, you were quoting Friedrich Nietzsche when you said Plato's Christianity for the masses. Um, uh, I think that's right, and I think what's interesting is though that it's not more wealth that Plato's. I mean, that's the thing. I think that
No,
that the
no, no, no. It's
capitalist
not
is
more
hung
wealth.
up on. It's not more wealth, and obviously for Christ, it's
It's
not
more
more
good.
wealth.
It's more beauty.
It's more
It's
good, more beauty.
more beauty.
Exactly,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly. So I think like the idea of more wealth, I think would have, and the way that Christianity gets marshaled into that too is just fascinating, right? Like Matthew 19:24 somehow gets obliterated out of the rich man. It's harder for the rich man to get into heaven than the camel to pass through the eye of a needle. That just gets obliterated in their thinking, and also the way of obviously the way Christ lived. So I again I think that's part of that. That's a fundamental difference in this earlier time. But even you said something at the beginning of the conversation I thought was really good, that capitalism is a mistake about modernity, right? And I really think that, and
Right.
I think that's a so there's a whole line of Marxists that just think capitalism is modernity, right? And I think that I really am opposed to that idea. Like I really think that modernity opens up this possibility for a break from tradition that then capitalism obfuscates, it misses, it allows us to find some other kind of authority to bow down to. And so I think that I'm really committed to modernity and without capitalism.
Would it be fair to say that in your reading here and the distinction between modernity and capitalism, that this something different is that modernity is breaking from tradition on the level of reinventing our social relations, here thinking about liberty, equality, fraternity, for example, as
Yeah.
fundamental values, and that obviously capitalism falls into contradiction with these values. You
Mm-hmm.
can't have egalitarianism and liberty and fraternity on a social level, in capitalism, structurally speaking, and that in many ways we let capitalism do our social relations for us, and that's the mistake.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right. And it isn't interesting that the 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 social radicals of the French Revolution were defeated. They were too radical and they were defeated. The ones that really wanted what you were talking about, that kind of modernity, like economic equality, of freedom for everyone, a real sense of solidarity, like they were destroyed. And I mean, maybe partly through their own excesses too, but I think and then that was not in the American Revolution. That was not that was not the driving force of that revolution. So I think that that's exactly right. That there's a real that those are not. I think we should not think that those are somehow capitalist values. I'm absolutely convinced of that. That there's somehow those values are ideological mechanisms of the capitalist system. I think that's completely wrong. So I totally agree with the way you put it.
There's a few different ways I wanted to take it, but I wanted to labor maybe a little bit on this tension between, let's say, the social values of modernist political revolutions and the reality of capitalism. That's how I've kind of understood the tensions that arise in 1848 revolution and the 1917 revolution, that it became evident to people in the 19th century, basically, that these modernist social values were in some sort of fundamental antagonism with a society structured by capitalism. And at the same time, it seems to be this persistent, impossible problem that we can't overcome and can't seem to think our way out of. And I do think that this unity between lack and excess is a really interesting one to focus on. And if we can tease out some alternative ways of thinking about politics through that, I think it would be really great. But yeah, what do you think about the way in which it seems like we're haunted by this. Um, we're haunted
Yeah.
by both our modernist value systems and the way in which it comes into contradiction with capitalism. It seems.
Right, right. I mean, what's haunting what changes depending on the epoch, right? Like now I think we're so thoroughly invested in the capitalist side of things that those values are kind of haunting us as like this is what we've betrayed. But I think you're right, like every attempt to realize those values, capitalism is the specter haunting that, right? Then that makes it, and that ends up overturning the attempt to really constitute an egalitarian society or whatever it is. And I think that's yeah. And I think so it's interesting to me that this is why I'm so invested in Hegel and psychoanalysis, because they're both about this, seeing this dialectical connection that I think is inherent to those values of freedom, equality, solidarity, and is anathema to that capitalist structure, which depends upon you investing. This is, I really believe the idea of this book that it really, the capitalism doesn't work if you don't believe in the promise of pure excess. And so that's why I think if you can, if people can broadly grasp that dialectical relation between lack and excess, then I think then then the seduction of that capitalist impulse it loses its power over you. I think. I mean, this I've seen it happen to people, so I don't. It's not something that I just am baldly theorizing.
I want to take your claim seriously and relate it back to my journey with capitalism, because I sort of, in many ways, I view myself sometimes as a naive modernist, and I struggle with that sometimes because it seems like I encounter more people today that think we can only get the human social relationships through some sort of return to religious values or traditional values. It's rare to meet someone who genuinely believes in the modernist social values and sort of like tries to live out their life that way. Like again, this, the liberty, the equality, the fraternity. But in many ways, I am fundamentally motivated by trying to, as it were, if I was to say it very simply, do cool things with friends. Like, you know what I mean? Like I just want to do cool things with my friends, and of course I want us all to be free and equal and have a brothership or a fraternity. And of course, that's incredibly difficult. and at the same time, like my journey has been as a teen, perhaps unconscious with the excess of the commodity, again towards this minimalism, which does give me a reflective capacity to not be an unconscious capitalist subject, even if I'm still within capitalism. But I think, as you alluded to, you say, I take up trying to run a small business, you're still fundamentally in a capitalist positionality. And I guess the higher reflection, this is as far as I can get with it, the higher reflection on lack and excess is that it does kind of disillusion you to the possibility that the MCM, like the more money part of the commodity equation, is going to somehow solve your subjective condition, or is going to give you what you want, like just the more money, the endless accumulation of the more money that I guess where I'm at with is what can happen there is that you can short circuit potentially the more money side of the equation, and you can funnel that more money into the possibility of creating higher order social relationships or something like that.
Yeah,
that's kind of that's where I struggle. That's where
no, I think it's a hard question because I think our mutual friend Michael Downs, he was saying we were talking about this book, and he said, well, I really want to try to make some money to survive on my Patreon, and I don't want to have to feel bad about that, and I think he shouldn't feel bad about that, and I think but I do think it's not at all right, and I think it's because I think it's isn't it the question of like what's serving what, right? Like if you're
Yeah.
putting the capitalist thing in service of this direct, like theoretical development and development of democratic values that you and I share totally, then I think it's a different thing, because there have to be spaces, and the university is totally under attack, and it's also costly to get into. So that's not a space that is secure for that. So I think that to help create those spaces and to make a living doing that seems to me that's the ideal kind of thing. So I think that's the
Right.
question for me always was, what's the relation? Like, is the relation that the capital is like you're doing the thing to garner more capital? And I
Yeah.
think I've seen
Yeah.
people, even theorists, who are trying to, you can see what they're doing is they're trying to use theory to find a way to create more capital for themselves. Or is it the opposite? Is it like, I'm just trying to use whatever capital I have to push into develop this theory, and I just want to survive while I'm doing it? And yeah, I think that seems to me to be, again, I think a kind of ideal that, right. Yeah.
Well, I think that, I mean, and this is a point you make in the book, but like, I think that where you find yourself, if you basically have, let's say, just, capital is the end in itself, like where capital is what's
Yeah.
being maximized, I think that you can't help but find yourself in the position of a fetishization, right? Like you're fetishizing
Yeah.
the capital accumulation. So that's why I kind of see, I'm increasingly thinking about it, and I think this is just what Zizek and the Slovenian school think, is that we live in a perverted society. That we live in a perverted society because the good, let's say, you also talk about this in the book, that the good
Yeah.
has just been replaced by capital accumulation. And at the same time, there is this temptation to try to go back to a traditional good. But I think what you're trying to say in the book is that we should avoid that temptation. We need to reconcile ourselves with excess in contradiction with the good.
Yeah.
But see it as entwined with lack, that we can't fall
Right.
into this pure affirmation of excess.
Right, because those things that you described as the values that you hold, they're not good, right? That's not the social good in the sense that Aristotle or Plato understood it, right? And I think they're excessive, like they're not useful. And I think that's really, I think I do give credit to capitalism for this, that it does show us that the useless, what has inutility, like that really is the source of what makes our life worth living. But we have to connect that uselessness to what we're lacking as well. And so, like, it's not just a useless excess, it's also tied to what we lack. And then I think, but I do think that's a really important insight to have, and not to try to go back to some notion of the good. I'm really against this idea of return to nature or return to traditional society.
Yeah.
I always think that's just a way to miss that you can't ever go back. And it also is such a nostalgic idealization of the past too, I think.
Make the good great again.
Yeah. That's right. No, I think that's absolutely, someone did a nice thing for me. They sent me a shirt or a hat, I can't remember, that said "Make alienation great again," and I liked that. But again, it has that kind of nostalgic, like anything that's again, I think is probably wrong, because it's always there. You're never. I mean, this great line from Hegel where he says, "People have never learned anything from history," and it gets quoted all the time, right? As a attack on people for not learning the lessons of history, but no one ever quotes the next line, which is, "And they're right too, because every historical situation is totally particular and different. So history has no lessons to teach us." And I think it's true. Like you can't go back to a certain historical moment because it's so different from our current moment that it's never going to be instructive, and things have changed so much that you're never going to be able to return to that. So, I mean, that's why I always think I read this stuff about sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, but on this point of Hegel's history, what's coming to my mind is wouldn't Hegel say that it's not that we learn from history, but that we learn from repetition when something repeats itself? Like if something happens once, maybe it was an accident. If something happens twice, you should be paying attention to it. Like
Right, right,
I give
right.
the example of like Trump's first election and his second election. Like,
Well, that it's really an interesting Hegelian point about that, right? Because his are mostly negative, right? Like Napoleon had to be defeated twice.
yeah.
But I think that
What
I
about
think
a double
Trump's
victory?
yeah, a double victory I think is really I think it was just this and it's interesting how you're not living, you're now undergoing it, but it's interesting how the shifts in the first administration weren't that tangible for most people. I mean, the symbolic gesture, building the wall, whatever. But now
Right.
they really have infected every aspect of people's lives. I mean, the universities are being, they're utterly under attack. So it's a fascinating, I think that really is a great point that he raises. I think that, and I think it ties to it. There's a nice Lacanian analysis too, right? That the first time it just seems like this, it's like just this thing
Maybe it
in the
was a mistake.
wheel.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then
Who
it gets
knows?
symbolically registered the second
Yeah.
time and shifts the symbolic structure, I think. So that I think has happened, and it does. I think that's exactly right. That it does. It has to happen that way.
I personally think that this repetition points towards basically, and I see this everywhere, is like left, right, any political orientation. No one wants to identify with liberalism anymore. And everyone is looking for some sort of post-liberal coordinates or
Right.
post-neoliberal society. There's the and just because of the signifiers, we tend to use terms. Maybe we overuse terms like fascism and communism,
Yeah. Maybe.
but the right wing will have some sort of fascist, more nationalist direction, and then the on the left, it's perhaps less politically powerful right now, but you do see repetitions of people pushing for something that looks like international socialism.
Right. And also, I think am I wrong about this, or is anarchism kind of having a new day, or is it maybe I'm wrong about that on the left?
No, I don't. Well, I think I've been tarrying with Chris Catrone's work a lot over the last year, and he opens his latest book, Marxism and Politics, by saying that the fundamental tension of the millennial left appears between anarchism and Leninism, basically.
I see.
And the anarchism is not wanting to take up the question of the state,
Right.
and the Leninists are basically saying that without taking up the question of the state, we're always going to be reduced to maybe more of a local primitive form of communism.
Or resistance, right? Like you're always in the resistance. I think that's right.
Sure.
I was just thinking I've been listening a lot and reading of Catherine Malibu, who's totally, I don't know if you know, but she's like totally shifted over to being an anarchist, and she wasn't that before. I mean, she wrote a book on Hegel, for God's sake, who's about as opposite to anarchism as you could possibly get. Yeah. So I think I do think that there is this. I think you're right to identify
Mm-hmm.
this. Do you think it's a general sense of exhaustion with liberalism, or that because I think a couple things. I think liberalism didn't protect us
Freedom and
from.
its discontents.
Yeah.
I think you know what it is. It's people, I think, are dissatisfied with the. On the one hand, people think we're too free, but I think it's just that we have a degraded form of freedom. I think these people tend more towards trying to. They think we need to re-solidify our freedom with a traditional notion of the good.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the other hand, I think probably the more Zizkian orientation would be that we have this kind of false freedom, like this freedom of a false choice, like Pepsi or Coke. So like that would lead you more towards we need a kind of re-articulation of the very coordinates within which we are free.
Yeah. No, I think that's right, and I do think it's certainly this Well, I guess I hear liberalism as a slur from both sides, right? So
Yeah,
that's what's
I do too.
interesting about what. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I
I
do
mean,
too. I think
especially
the
this
center's
turn.
breaking.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's right. I mean, it kind of Yeats way. Yeah.
Well, on this question of liberalism failing, and
Yeah.
right now at Philosophy Portal, I'm teaching a course on the early Marx, and I just read and taught the 1844 manuscript paper, the
Yeah.
philosophic and economic manuscripts paper.
Yep.
And I want to tie this into your thesis about trying to see the dialectical unity between excess and lack. Because my interpretation of Marx in the early Marx is that he kind of transposes the pure excess of capital into communism itself. That he sees communism as kind of a fully complete big other. That there's all these lines in the economic and philosophical manuscripts about the nature of communist society and the nature of communist man, and you just get this sense that there's no more lack there. Like
Yeah.
that the
Right.
gap between the
Right.
individual and the species is unified, and
Right.
you just get this idea that everything will be right, everything will
I
be
know.
as it should be.
Well, I think he really thought that. I think
Yeah.
I've read quite a few biographies about Marx, and he and Jenny used to in the house say, after the revolution, we won't have to deal with this kind of nonsense. So, like, just as a, how when you're with your person in your house, you just use these little phrases, and I always found that fascinating that would be their way of talking. I mean, it's not fair to use that as a critique of him, but I do think it bespeaks this investment in that basically communism would be all the best parts of capitalism without the, like what we were just talking about, without all the we could realize liberty, equality, and fraternity without all the negative parts of capitalism. And I think that that's just not true, right? I think I think this is, so we have to be dialectical about capitalism too, that the worst things about it are precisely what make it so productive, right? Like all the things that we think, oh, if only we could have capitalism without that, sorry, that's the thing that really makes it work. And one of the things that I say in the book is that we think of the corner store. I think I talk about this in terms of the film Out of the Past, which is a great film noir, but we think of the corner store as the model for how capitalism works, right? Like the corner store sells a little bit to the gas station, and then they get the gas station goes to the bakery and buys some bread, and then the bread, they come and they feed the corner store guy, gets bread from the bakery. Like that whole, we imagine, is this perfect circle where there's
Right.
nothing excessive, right? And so,
Yeah.
and then we think of someone like
This is
Amazon
this
as
is
this.
Adam Smith model, right?
It is. It's totally an
Yeah.
Adam Smith model, right? And what's funny is in Out of the Past, Robert Mitchum just describes exactly that. And this other guy goes, yeah, don't give me that. He's kind of a Jeff Bezos. I mean, this is mean to Jeff Bezos because he's a cold-blooded killer, but he's a kind of a Bezos gambler, and I think we think Amazon's the predator, and the corner store is the real capitalist destroyed by this predator. But I think no, Amazon's the real capitalist, and the corner store is actually the parasite on Amazon. That Amazon is what keeps any of these huge companies that offshore their labor, that do whatever they can to keep their costs low, that maximize their like they're the ones that keep the capitalist system running, and that allows for these little local businesses to function because the whole system is functioning. So I think it's true, and I think this is what Marx misses for me, is that no, sorry, the worst things about capitalism are also the best things about it. They're not, you can't have the one without the other. And I think I don't think that gets corrected in the Grundrisse or in Capital either. So I think that's an idea. You're right. It's most explicit in the 1844 manuscripts, but I think there are passages I could point to in Capital where he's basically saying that same thing.
Well, that's important because it means it's not something that can be easily swept aside with like just this idea of an epistemological break in Marx,
Right.
right? Like where
Right.
early Marx has this problem, but maybe late Marx
Right.
has resolved it or something like that. I
Right.
think that Marx is at his best when he's just coldly analyzing the way feudalism and capitalism function.
I know.
And then
It's
as
beautiful, really,
it
isn't
is
it? I mean,
great, it's great work.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
But then
yeah.
it's like weird, like he does such a good, precise analysis of the way this is the way feudalism works. This is the fundamental antagonism in it. Then this is how capitalism works. This is the fundamental antagonism with it. But then he starts theorizing forms of socialism and communism where it seems like there's no fundamental antagonism in it. Like
Right.
like he gets rid of the antagonism in it.
Right, which is I think it's just proof of Hegel's notion that the owl of Minerva takes flight only with the falling of dusk, right? Like you can't because when you think about the future, I think you tend to think about it phantasmatically. You tend to think about it antagonism free in the way that you're saying. And I think that that's the point at which Marx I think falls short when he's not, to put it in my terms, he's not Hegelian enough, right? That he, yeah.
Well, it is hard. I mean, I'm trying to, because I do really think that one of my motivations was if we do deep studies of Hegel first and then go into Marx, maybe we can get insight into how Marx was thinking, because of course he's drenched in Hegelianisms in his early writings.
Right.
And I do think that Marx must have been theoretically, philosophically necessary in the sense that I don't think you can find a real analysis of capitalism in Hegel himself that required Marx. But there's this way in which when you look at the political structures of our world today, I feel like the philosophy of right in Hegel's work stands up more to the test of just empirical observation than Marx's theorizations of a transition from capitalism to socialism. To be fair, I think we have made some gains in terms of socialization of capital, but they're pretty modest in
Yeah.
comparison to the types of things he was thinking might occur or transpire.
Right. Right.
Rather, it's like the weird, and this I'll throw it back to you, like, but the weird irony it feels like to me in terms of like Marx flipping Hegel on his head is that Marx thought there was going to be a higher humanist social reality possible in capitalism, like to go beyond it. But really what's happened is that there's just been these deepening industrial revolutions which give us these images of a post-human reality, like, and Mikey Downs talks about that as well, right? Like like
Right.
now the industrial revolution's producing the post-human. Now it's
Yeah.
AI, and it's like,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's gonna transcend the human. It's like
Yeah. Yeah.
at least
Yeah.
the fantasy. This
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
itself is a pure. This itself, I would just as a sort of thought for you, like that the post-human is itself maybe this image of pure excess,
Well, right. Right. I mean, that's the image is of a
a machine which
non-lacking.
doesn't lack.
Right, the non-lacking other. Right. I think that's. It's funny because we had our initial department retreat at the university, and one of the subjects was AI, as you can imagine. And I said, well, one way you could just start the class is ask it, describe Hegel's philosophy, and then you could go and just say point by point, wrong, 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 and then you could go on to your class. You could say, so if your papers have a bunch of errors in them, I'll know that you used AI. And someone said, well, not everyone could, whatever. They didn't like that idea, but I think I think it's really important to think that AI will always be a lacking. So isn't that what's great about Blade Runner, right? That Roy Batty is a lacking subject. That guy he's more of a subject than Deckard, whatever Deckard's status is. So I think to me, the image of Blade Runner is so much better than the image of Terminator 2, right? Or Terminator 1, because Terminator really has this image of a non-lacking big other. I mean, you could read, I guess, a lack into it because it has to go into the past, right? But still, it's pretty much a non-lacking big other. whereas Blade Runner really, I think, tries to envision this, that actually when we create this this more than human, this replicant, it's going to be worse. Like Roy Batty feels his being towards death worse than the humans do, right? And I thought I love that about that movie. I think it's so, and he also, and this is a nice dialectical point, it also allows him to act heroically and save Deckard's life, right? Like he's able to, even at the moment he's dying, he's able to save the life of this guy that's trying to kill him. So I think that seems like the proper vision of the meta-human or the transhuman or the whatever we're coming on.
Maybe you got to be a consultant for the movie industry, because when I think about most movies about the post-human future, it's usually framed as the human is lacking and the post-human is not lacking. Like I think about her.
What is the worst?
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I'm so glad you said that. The worst example of this is Her, I think, which it's funny because some of my psychoanalytic friends love Her and they wrote articles on it, and I just was like, you've missed the whole thing. This film is terrible because it's utterly invested in a non-lacking, whatever Scarlett Johansson's name is. She's a non-lacking. She can love.
She can have
right?
14,000 love relationships.
Right. Whereas poor Joaquin Phoenix, he can only have one, and she's betrayed him. So yeah, I think that's. I just think that is, and I think that's Her is the paradigm. And what's interesting is I think Her is also how all these billionaires think about either AI or about the transhuman, right? That like it's going to be it's going to be a singularity, right?
I think it is in a weird way prophetic, in the sense that I see many people interacting with ChatGPT almost in a similar way to the way you see it depicted in Her, where like you get this image in Her of like it's a lonely society, it's a individuated, atomized society, and people are just talking to the chatbots. And I feel like that's, like I'm sure you've come across this yourself, but like, people using ChatGPT to do therapy, or
that's a big thing.
It's become a big thing. I have like a huge resistance to people outsourcing their mental labor to LLMs. I find it strange and almost disappointing or depressing in some way, because I don't find the LLMs too impressive. Like I feel like, how can you seriously replace an analytic function with ChatGPT? It seems absurd, but yeah,
right. And I think, isn't the most valuable function of a therapist, not even a psychoanalyst, just a therapist, is that they say the thing that you don't want to hear, right? That's the great intervention. That's the intervention that stops you from that puts you in a different direction. And the whole point of the LLM is that it's trying to, that's part of what it's trying to do. It's trying to please you. And you can't have a therapist. It's like could you imagine? It's almost like they thought, what's this guy Jacques Lacan say about what the psychoanalyst should be? Let's make something just the opposite into our form. And that's what they did.
Yeah.
Because look, I went to a Lacanian analyst, and let me just say, he never said one word that pleased me. Not even when I just said a normal question. I would just say, I would ask questions like, what do other people think in this situation? He's like, other people. And that was all he would say. That was just so dissatisfying. So, but he was forcing me to think, right? And to question like why I had the assumptions that I have. But I think that if ChatGPT is functioning as your therapist, they're never going to do that. And so I've read things by, the ChatGPT saved me from killing myself. But I don't think, to me, if that happened, you were never going to kill yourself, because the point is, if you know what I'm saying? Like if you think you're going to really kill yourself and you go
Yeah.
to it, it's never going to direct you in a different path. It's going to direct you down the path that you're on, I think. And that seems to me, and that I think explains the hallucination effect too, that it's trying to please.
I do think that it's worthwhile actually thinking about the LLM as operating under the model of the pleasure principle, right?
Yeah.
And in that sense, what's probably going on, and I just got this idea from what you were saying, my hypothesis would be this, that people's fascinations with LLMs could be a kind of narcissistic mirroring phenomenon,
Right.
like that they're just
And one without, I
getting
think what you're
themselves.
saying, this is, sorry.
No, just
Yeah.
that they're
Yeah. I
getting
think that's
themselves
great.
mirrored.
I mean, I
It's
think
just a
that,
mirroring.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think I really want to pick up on your, like, it's just the pleasure principle, right? Like, it seems like there's nothing of death drive in the LLM, right? Like, it's just because it's just this, it's just pure, I'm give, like, what is it that you want from me? I'm going to give that to you right back. Right. And the problem is that our desire isn't for what we think that we want from the other person. It's for what we don't think that we want. Right. And I think that's what doesn't it doesn't give. But I think it all comes back to what you were saying earlier about this imagining of a big other that's not lacking, right? An other that's a non-lacking other. I think that's, to me, that's what's at work in all of the investment in this and the belief in it. I mean, I'm not against it per se. I just think as long as you acknowledge that it's just going to be another version of a lacking figure.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, if we think about like a minimal definition of the big other as the subject supposed to know,
Yeah.
that is how people are treating it, right? I mean, that's how people are,
Yeah.
they're treating it, that they're asking it questions, and then they're treating the knowledge as somehow divinely verified by the algorithm. And I've
Yeah.
really liked, I've started to learn more about and become attracted to this idea of the dead internet theory. And I'm trying to link it to death of God theology. That the way we
Okay.
treat the internet and the way we treat LLMs and the way we treat just the infrastructure of social media is kind of like God, in the sense that if our channel succeeds or if our work succeeds, if we do well on the algorithm, that somehow we're being recognized by God. Or
Yeah.
even that like these LLMs are the subject supposed to know. And I think that the big challenge today is, how do we use the internet against the internet in a way? How do we use the internet towards a new form of human social life, as opposed to this kind of ironic, like maybe like the most ironic name in history is that we're on social media platforms, because they're really the
I know.
antithesis of sociality in a way.
Yeah. 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 I think that's right. I mean, what you're saying, and I think that the notion that, I mean, this comes back to what we were really saying about the way in which we're in this massive betrayal of modernity, right? Because modernity is supposed to free us from this traditional notion of God, and yet we're constantly reinventing that figure of God and not the Christian God, I would say. No, that's what's interesting, because the Christian God is a God that's lacking, right? The
Exactly.
God, right?
Yeah,
And so that's
exactly.
real. I think it's really, it's a kind of heretical form of religion, because it insists upon a non-lacking God, and I think that that's really,
It's a
I think
pagan
you're
plenitude,
exactly,
Todd. It's a pagan plenitude.
it is, and it is, and I have to say, when if I look on Amazon and whatever, and my book has 5 star, I'm like, oh, good. So I even fall for it too, right? Like, I think it's really difficult to get out of that sense that the big other God has finally validated me in some way. So I think it makes me feel like, almost like when I wrote my book on comedy, my mom said to me, "You finally wrote a good book." And I thought, oh, okay, I have the big other's validation now. But I think that's exactly how it functions. That social media functions that way. That the LLM functions that way. It's all about, I'm going to get this fundamental both recognition and answer, final answer, that's going to be not questionable, right?
Yeah, I mean, I even think like when you go down to like, I'm here when I say I'm talking about myself, I feel like when you go down to like the base level of checking for likes or recognitions or views or whatever it is on social media, that at the core of it is this desire to be like fully recognized by the big other, like that finally, you know, that there's finally the other is there recognizing me, like, but it's all in these micro, you know, almost like these micro recognitions. But
Yeah, yeah.
no,
Don't you
that's
think
what
it's
needs to
funny?
die. That's what needs to die.
I know, but don't you think it's funny? I agree. That needs to die. I think what's funny is if you knew the different people that were doing the likes, you'd be like, I don't know. A like from that person isn't really such a great thing, right? But the key is you don't know who it is, and I think there's a little
Right.
Hegel master servant quality, right? Like if you like the master gets recognized by the servant only because the servant is not worthy of recognizing the master, right? And I think that's true of all the person you really want to, like. I would write a book. I wish that, I don't know, Alain Badiou would write a 5-star review, right? But he's not going to be writing one. So whoever it is, it's going to be,
Yeah, good luck.
the only thing that makes it worthwhile. I know he probably isn't even reading anymore. The only thing that makes it worthwhile is that you don't know who it is, I think. And so you can project this pure unlacking, non-lacking other there.
Yeah, it's really, I think, the antithesis, but it's the antithesis of sociality, but it is also this, it gives us insight into the perhaps the necessary transcendental illusion of this full God and our need to sort of undergo this destitution repetitively. That's like the weird thing for me about the
Yeah.
Christian atheism thesis, is that yes, God doesn't exist and all there is us and our social forms, but it seems like every generation of human beings needs to repetitively enact the structural illusion of God and have it fall and fail. And there's something just ironically ridiculous and absurd about that, because it seems like as
Yeah.
long as humans are being born, we're not going to be able to get rid of that structure.
Yeah. I wonder if do you think that's right? Or do you think it's that I'm just riffing on my friend Rick
Yeah,
Boothby's
go for
book
it.
about religion. Like for him, our investment in religion is precisely an investment in this, in the gap in the other, right? And so that's why I understand that what you're talking about is a little different. It's about the way we're erecting a figure that actually fills in that gap. But for him, the religious impulse itself is this impulse about the fact that you're confronted by this, even by the person in front of you, and there's just this core of something you can't grasp about them, and I think that for him is and I agree with that this is the religious impulse. But I think you're right that, putting that aside, there does seem to me the need to kind of erect this figure that fills, like, it's not a God of the gap, it's a God that fills in the gap, right? So it's a very, what's funny to me is it's a very not, even though it's often Christian, it's a very non-Christian idea of God. I always laugh when the athletes point up to the sky and think God helped them make a good play, because they're all Christian that do it, most of them that I see. And I just want to say, well, that's not a very Christian idea of God. That's one of the most heretical things you could possibly do, because God is identified with the most humiliated figure, right? Not with the triumph. Like, you should point to God when you fail, not when you have the great triumph. But I don't know. So I think that there's both things are at work, because I do, if I
Yeah.
find what you're saying pretty convincing, but I also think there is something in that being drawn to God that is also, I would even say, radical. That's about the gap within the signifying structure.
Well, I think we're both Rawlinsians in a way, so I think that we can agree on that. This radical
Yeah.
gap as the source of true religion. It's just that it's this double. It's I guess it's this double movement, right? It's both we erect this figure to fill the gap that needs to fail, and then
Yeah.
through the failure we can have this deeper or other perspective on the gap itself.
Yeah. Maybe it's
as
impossible to
as a
just
true religion.
experience. Yeah, right. Maybe it's impossible to
You
experience
miss
the gap.
something without that necessary transcendental illusion.
Yeah. So everybody has to grow up a fundamentalist. And that's kind of what you're saying, right?
Well, I even like, because I was raised atheist. I wouldn't say I was raised atheist. I was just raised without any specific belief structure. But as a young man, I would say that I did go through a phase of fundamentalism, but it was like more of like a fundamentalist atheism. But like it was still a
Yeah.
form of fundamentalism. Like if I look back on like talking, if I could talk to the 20-year-old version of myself, I would experience myself as a fundamentalist subject. Even if I wasn't a religious
Yeah.
fundamentalist, there was still a fundamentalism.
Right. No, that's what I was getting at. Yeah, that you kind of go through this experience where you have erected some figure
Yes.
as this non-lacking God, like God, for really, and that you
And I
have
think
to have that experience.
And I think today people are doing it primarily through the internet. Like that's why I like this idea of like a dead internet theory. It's like that's what we have to die to today or something like that. But
Yeah. No, I like the way that modifying death of God to dead internet theory. I think that's really good. Yeah.
It's funny too because my doctoral supervisor wrote he's a theorist of the global brain. He has this idea of the global brain theory. It's this idea that the internet structurally functions like the neurons in our brain function, and that it's like the networks on the internet are like a global brain. And he did kind of metaphorically see the internet as like a god. So he didn't have this idea of the dead internet theory, or he didn't have this idea of death of God theology. I think he would scoff at it, but it's still this idea of the internet as this full plenitude. So it's this, again, I think it's falling for pure excess.
You're right. I mean, I think it's interesting to me.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No,
I was just going to say it's
for
interesting
it.
to me how you can see this. Yeah, these other things that don't seem to be capital itself, but nonetheless have this structure of pure excess associated with them, right? Within capitalist society.
I think capitalism's capitalism's the most dominant form at the moment, but I wonder the historicity of it, and if we were in a different system. I think that's the really hard thing to think. Like if we were in a different system, we use things like socialism and communism, but would that big other still, would that pure excess appear in a different form?
Yeah, and I think one of the arguments I make in the book about, maybe in this book, maybe it's a different book, about the break between traditional society and modernity is that in traditional society, that excess was all put in one place, right? Like ritual or ritual sacrifice, whatever. Orgies, maybe. Symposiums, however you translate Plato. So I think that's so I think you're right that you can't get rid of it. And I don't think it's necessarily better to have it in one place, but I think I guess the question that we're kind of getting to is it possible to see the connection to structure a society around the dialectical connection between lack and excess? That I think is that's a genuine question. Like I don't think there's an open answer to that. And I think there couldn't be a Marx that would come along and write that book and say, this is how it's going to turn out, because I don't think you would even know how it's going to turn out. Just back to the French Revolution. That's what I like about that about the French Revolution compared to the Russian, is that they didn't have a map for what they were trying to do, right? Like they were just trying to figure out a way to put these ideas into practice. And they didn't know what the best form would be. They were just trying things out. And I kind of like that and And I think that was really influential on Hegel and his notion that philosophy is always behind politics, that it's never guiding it, it's never telling it what to do.
Right. I'm still there. I'm with the owl disposition. Um,
Yeah.
over, for example, the rooster, the what is it called, the Gaelic cock,
Right. Right.
crowing. I guess with a itself that would be the pure excess of the full knowing of the plan for revolution or something like that.
Right. Right.
But one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, and what's very clear, structuring a lot of the introduction of pure excess, is the way you're talking about pure excess in capitalist society as introducing a key distinction with all previous traditional societies, where it seems to me like you're saying previous traditional societies would privilege reproduction over production, whereas modern
Yeah.
society or capitalist society privileges production over reproduction. And of course, you don't mention it in the introduction, but like this topic of natalism, anti-natalism, pro-natalism, this question of reproduction is intimately tied up into many of these themes we've been talking about people trying to make America great again, or make the good great again, like this desire for a traditional resolidification of society. I think a lot of
Hmm.
it has to do over this anxiety of production being placed as a value over reproduction, and that there's no more space anymore for a genuine human social reproduction.
Right. I think it's just absolutely true that it's not a value within capitalism. That capitalism, the whole point is the production of excess. So it's a fascinating thing, because you would think certainly every animal society, every animal and every previous human society values what are we going to do to reproduce ourselves as a society, right? That's just the most important thing. And you would think even in terms of evolution, that's the most important thing. But I think what's really fascinating about capitalism, and this is why I find it funny that so many evolutionary thinkers or so many capitalist thinkers use evolution as their justification for capital. I think it's funny because it runs totally against that, because the whole point is, can you produce excessively and reproduction be damned? And I really feel like that's the key part of the break. Like that is the real break, that all of a sudden reproduction doesn't matter. If it happens, it kind of happens. And that's why I think you couldn't even imagine a natalist movement in the Middle Ages, right? It just wouldn't make any sense, because people would say, of course we're reproducing. And the way that I even think and there are other causes for this, obviously, but the withdrawal from sex on the part of younger people today, right? Like, I think it's porn related a lot, but I think it's also there's no point. Reproduction is kind of pointless. Not that, of course, that all sex is reproductive sex. But I think that's, I just think that there's a real sense that reproduction within capitalism doesn't matter. And so that explains this attempt to make it matter. But I think it also explains why people aren't that concerned with it, that they really think I can live a valuable, important life, significant life with significance for myself without worrying about reproduction. Of course, I think whatever, people shouldn't be required to have kids, and I'm not a natalist, but I think it's really, that's just a fascinating shift that occurs within capitalism. But don't you think it's ironic, Cadell, that historically that meant, this emphasis on production meant an explosion of population, because it's only under capitalism that the world population just exploded. There was a kind of slight increase historically, but then capitalism comes along and it's just exponential increase. But now it seems like we're reaching a moment where that's not going to happen anymore. And I think the most predictive models are for a pretty radical decline. And once the decline starts, then it's a real problem of how to get out of it. So, I mean, this won't be in either of our lifetimes, but I think that is a fascinating shift within capitalism. And I think I think it's what's interesting is both of those phenomena to me are tied to this emphasis on production over reproduction.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're articulating it very well. To me, what gnaws at me in all of these political polarizing topics of people identifying with either natalism or anti-natalism, it seems to me like there must be something we're not thinking properly about this topic, because on the one hand, I think you raised that really important point, which is often not raised, which is that our population over the last 200 years has exploded, actually, globally.
Yeah.
From basically like a flat line of like a billion humans throughout most of medieval history, or probably even less, to 8 billion
Much
now.
less, yeah, much
and
less.
and
Yeah,
yeah, much
yeah,
much less. And so yeah, it really did explode. And now we have kind of this huge anxiety over, I don't think it's so much the fact that we're not going to exist in 100 years or something like that if we don't start reproducing, but just that it does seem like the structures of capitalism have become so antagonistic with social reproduction. And what are we going to do about that? Like, and then there are
right.
some like canaries in the coal mine, like, and the canaries in the coal mine are like those countries, a lot of them in East Asia, but some in Western Europe as well, where the fertility rate's below one. And that's
Right.
just
I think
super
Korea it's
weird.
0.8, isn't it? Yeah, I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
Korea
And
is the
there are
maybe
some really
leading
strange
the world in
examples.
this. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think it is interesting because I think it's this emphasis on production that pushes, and the development and the way that capitalism is, and I think it's also tied to the atomization that capitalist society produces, right? Like the more we talked about that at the very beginning, the more you feel totally atomized, the less you're even going to go out and feel like you want to even get in a relationship. I think my sense is relationships are going to be increasing. Even relationships are going to be increasingly rare, let alone ones with children attached to them. So I mean, maybe that's wrong, but I really, I see it just among students that they're not even interested really in long term. By the time I was a senior in college, I had two like long term girlfriends and other kinds of shorter term ones, but my among I have one of my twins has had none. Like he's had different, like, I guess, like temporary things, but never somebody he brought home to meet us or anything. So I think that's really, to me, that's just a shocking. He's not antisocial at all. He has tons of friends. He's always going out to bars. So to me, that he's emblematic in that way. That's not exceptional because all of his friends are the same.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's really disorienting to think about. And I guess the most thing that's disorienting to think about it is it's hard to think of a solution to it, and it's quite easy to imagine a kind of accelerationist social apocalypse.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I know. A kind of Nick Land fantasy or
Yeah,
something,
it's
right?
it's
Yeah.
not hard to
Yeah.
imagine that. It's actually,
Yeah. No, it's not.
you'd
It's
actually say
pretty
like
easy.
that's the
Yeah.
contemporary ideology.
Right. And in fact, I think there are places in China where there are whole apartment complexes like that are just deserted, basically deserted because of this very phenomenon. Right. So I think that kind of thing, I think the image of the ghost town is going to return, I think, to us in the next decades, it seems to me.
And do you think it's because human relationships are just really fundamentally messy, and that like actually having relationships involves a kind of social negativity or friction that you can't, well you that you can't get rid of, that it's constitutive to human
Yeah.
social relationships, that they're messy with friction and social negativity, and that people just aren't putting up with it anymore, or that people are just tending away from it, that they want social life within frictionless screens, or What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think it's probably right. I think it's probably right that there's, I mean, you've been in a relationship. It's there. It's
Yeah, I'm
like
married.
a day. You're married, so a day doesn't go by probably that there's not some at least little, not a fight, but a little scuffle, right? A little thing. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of that. I think that's part of it, and I think the other thing is this. To me, this is, I think it's a huge, I mentioned in passing before, but I think it's a huge part of it. The fact that porn was available to kids that are now growing up from the time they were 8 or 10 years old. I think their idea of sexual satisfaction, it no longer requires, and in fact, the other person makes it worse, right? It doesn't make it better. It makes it worse because you have to think about their needs. You have to think, you have to worry, like, are they going to have an orgasm? What do I have to do to make that happen? Is this going to finish too soon? Is it not going to finish soon enough? I mean, all these are real questions, right? And but if you're just dealing with the screen and the porn figure, you don't have to think about that sort of thing. So I really think it's a lot different than having just a opening the page of like Playboy magazine or whatever. It's a lot that the satisfaction of that seems significantly less. But I think now that I think that access to that from such a young age has really changed the way that people function. Not just guys either. I think women too. Like I think
Yeah. So
it's universal.
just in what you were saying, which to me is very, I mean, assuming for many Zoomers probably very relatable what you're describing, um, in terms of like the psychological mechanisms at work, which would tend them to move to. I mean, the porn would be here, the pure excess, right? And
Yeah, for
the
sure, for
challenge of
sure.
a new social life would be this unity with excess and lack, and that like that what you were describing people avoiding is lack basically. Like right, it's like it's dealing with
Right, right.
and dealing with lack in the most intimate way.
Right. Because I mean, it could, like it could be lack in a literal way, right? Like you're impotent. You're trying to have sex and you're impotent. And it's interesting. I
Exactly.
was talking about somebody else on someone else's podcast about this. So I apologize if someone has heard me say it. But porn stars now, you probably know this. They no longer, you obviously know what a fluffer is. Somebody that like a person that gives the porn star a blowjob to give them an erection so they can have sex, right? So they used to have fluffers on the set so the porn star the male would get the erection. But now what happens is the male porn star goes off in a room, masturbates to a little porn, and then comes back and has sex with the female porn star. So to me, isn't that such a fascinating shift, right? Like that
We need the
and
image.
we need the image more, like it's more
Yeah.
erotic, the
Yeah.
image,
Yeah. Yeah.
than the person standing right
Yeah.
before us. And that's
Yeah.
to me,
With
it's
all
like
their bodily
all is
smells.
revealed. Yeah. Isn't everything is kind of revealed by that? I love that fact because it's, I mean, I of course troubled deeply by it, but I think it's so revelatory because it's so much about the way in which pure excess functions via the screen, whereas when you come back to the body you have to deal with the lacking subject in front of you, and you're right, smells, but it's unpleasant, like does she like it, whatever, but on the screen there's none of that.
What it's reminding me of, and correct me if I'm remembering incorrectly here about Freud's theories of sexuality, but I recall in that book Freud talking about how we can't assume the object of fixation or the object of attachment in a process of sublimation, meaning we can't assume that man and woman is somehow like a natural heteronorm that overdetermines all sexuality. That there's all these weird fixations that people can develop that aren't necessarily falling into that heteronormativity. But now that it has this, I think, posthuman dimension to it, where our sexuality almost gets like more hooked to the screen than an actual body itself.
Yeah, I think that's a great reference to Freud, and it's also, I think, exactly right. And it does. The other thing that the screen allows you is to choose your particular perverse fantasy, right? Like you can, whatever your particular thing is, you're going to find an outlet for that. So you don't have to worry about the person corresponding to the fantasy because you'll always find something that will. And I think that's a really important aspect of it, that you can find there's all different, whatever the different fantasy is, you can find an avenue for it.
It almost makes sex more like the oral drive or the food drive, or maybe I should be thinking about this more complexly in the sense that in traditional society, both the oral drive and the genital drive, like our sexual drive and our desire to eat, was deeply wedded to the social, right?
Right.
Family
Right.
family dinners, like you'd have family dinner every night, and of course the sexual would be deeply tied to potentially a reproductive partner. But it
Right.
seems like now more and more people are having their basic drives divided up and atomized and increasingly difficult to socialize or humanize in some sense. That seems to be the zero level of the struggle. And yet, as misguided as it might be for people to reach for those traditionalist interpretations of for a solution, it doesn't seem like there's much innovation towards the socialization or the humanization of these drives, which you would take, I would assume, to be like any new leftist political organization or any leftist political movement. It would have to take care and attention to the socialization or the rehumanization
Right.
of these drives.
Right. I think you could maybe, that's a, it seems to me
It's a
like
big
you could
topic.
have a whole, no, I know, but it's a really, it's such an important one. And I think you could almost, don't you think you could almost explain the rise of these right wing populist figures around the world because they do what you're talking about, right? Like they don't. And whereas, like, what is, I always think, you really kind of opened something up for me because I think I've always puzzled why doesn't, why isn't Bernie Sanders, why wasn't he? I am not one of these that has the fantasy that if Bernie Sanders got the nomination in 2016, he would have beaten Donald Trump. I don't have that fantasy. But because I think the accusation of him being a communist would have been pretty damning. Um, but
Uh-huh.
why isn't he? He's pretty popular here in Vermont, but why isn't he or Ocasio Cortez? Why aren't they? Why don't they have the same libidinal appeal as Trump and around the world, Bolsonaro, whoever? Why don't they? Well, I think it's maybe it's for the reason you're talking about. Maybe that they aren't thinking about how to speak to the socialization of drives in the way that Trump, like that's a clear part. I mean, he's maybe outsourced it a little bit to Vance and the idea of the trad wife and that kind of thing. But like there still is a sense of like he's there is a concern for that, right? And I wonder if that's true of
Yeah,
all the right wing populist movements, that they are taking that into account in the way that the
I think
leftists,
so.
the genuine leftists who are focused on economy and not on these cultural issues like the Democrats are, the genuine leftists, I don't think they do. I don't think they think about that. And so it
They
makes me
don't.
think that's a real lacuna in the leftist project, right? Like that's a real, and I think it helps to really explain why. So if you say like, because people love to say everyone's voting against their interest, right? And I always say, I've never seen anyone do something in their interest, so why would that voting be any different? But I do think that does explain a lot about why people whose lives are being decimated by capital are so drawn to these figures that are pro-capitalist, because they are providing this other thing. I think that you're talking about this way of promise, at least, of socializing drives in a way that capital has stripped away. So that's really, I find that really compelling, Cadell.
I racking my brains around it all the time, and again, it's kind of part of this. Returning to the early Marx thing, I do think I agree with you. I think the left has avoided thinking about the socialization of drive, um, but also I think the right has a fundamental advantage in the sense that I think it's easier for them to appeal to ethnic and national sensitivities about
Yeah,
socialization of drive, and it's much more difficult to think about the socialization of drive in an internationalist way. And
it's
I think
absolutely true.
even and I think that the working class itself has a resistance to it. Like I think that's another thing is like when I'm reading Marx, he's always referring to Germany, and he's at least the early Marx, he's always referring to Germany and he's always referring to England, but it's just such a different world from the world we're living in. And I just wonder what Marx would say about the political tensions that exist in 2025, because it's so hard for me to see an international working class as a passionately motivated identity today. Because what I see as a passionately motivated identity is working class preferring to stay in capitalism as long as you keep the other people in the working class away from me.
Right, right. Yeah,
Right?
I even think no.
That's
I
more
think
dominant.
to me, I think it's more dominant. I think this is the problem even in Marx's time is that there he's waiting. No one wants to be a proletarian, right? Unless being a proletarian has what you're talking about, this nationalist pride attached to it. Like I'm a worker for the US or I'm a worker for China or something. But I don't think anybody, I think this is it's hard to construct a political movement where no one wants to be part of the core of the movement. I think like, if you ask most proletarians, they say, what do you want? I want to be rich. Like I want to not work anymore. I don't want to be a part of the working class. So I think whereas if it's a national identity, they want to sustain that. They want to keep being American. They want to keep being French. They want to keep being whatever it is.
Yeah.
So I think that that's a real problem. And I think it's historically been a problem with Marx. And I think it's why Lenin thought that when the results from the votes in Germany about the going into the war or not, he thought that they were just faked, that they didn't to World War I, because he thought, oh, the working class clearly didn't support entry into World War I because it was just a bourgeois war. But no, they did support it because they weren't identified first and foremost as part of the working class. And I think it's really tough to make a movement I just think Marxism is always going to founder on that you can't make a movement around a group of people that don't want to be in the thing that you want them to be in. And that's going to be the basis of the movement. I just don't think it's never going to be successful. And that I think, to me, we talked about other problems with Marx. To me, that is the fundamental problem with Marxist politics, that you're never going to convince a working class person that is their identity unless you do what you said, tie it to nationalism or ethnic, like I'm white,
Yeah.
I'm whatever it is, right?
Well, look at Germany and England today. Like in Germany and
Right,
England today, you've got the rise of the AFD, and you've got the
right,
rise of the Restore Britain party. Like these are both far right parties. Like I said, but that's where the genuine, like that's where the Germans and the English want to quote unquote socialize their drive. So
right,
I just
right,
don't
right.
see I don't see how we think around this issue. And then when you look to, for example, the far left parties in Britain, which are sort of a symptom also of the center breaking. I mean, they talk more about Palestine than they do about English people.
I know, I know,
So it's
I
so
know.
it's so I don't know how we think through these things.
Yeah, I think that the problem is that the contemporary political available possibilities are not appealing in any way. So I think I don't, and I think the leftist accelerationist thesis is just totally wrong. And I think these kind of like return to something that's completely misguided. So I do. I'm as at sea on this question as you are in terms of how to respond, other than to try to keep thinking through. I mean, I think what you're just saying about the socialization of the drives
Yeah.
and thinking about that in a different way is really, really important as a way to try to respond to the political situation. So that's one thing I hadn't ever thought of that, and I think it's a really great line of thought.
Well, you'd think it might be something that would have gotten more attention because there is a history of Freudo-Marxism, right? And you'd think, like, if you were to combine Freud and Marx in thinking about capitalism and politics, it would have to do something. It would have to operate somewhere there. Like, for example, in Marx's The German Ideology, he
Yep.
talks a lot about intercourse. Like, he's always talking about intercourse in that, but he's talking about intercourse on many levels. Like, he's talking about like international relations as forms of intercourse, right? Like, it's basically like a sexual
Right.
relationship at all these different
Right.
levels. And you'd think that there would be some way to wed psychoanalysis and Marxism at the level of the socialization of drive.
Yeah, isn't the problem that the books that have tried to do that have been terrible, basically, right? Like
Mm.
Eros and Civilization is Herbert Marcuse's worst book. Uh,
Uh-huh.
Wilhelm Reich is like a crazy guy. I think there
Right,
just
right,
haven't been like
right.
real, and I think the problem is that it got interpreted in a really I think Freud got interpreted in a really too much of a pro-capitalist way. That is, it
Uh-huh.
didn't it, what happened was Freud became the signifier of pure excess. So that became like it became this project of liberating our sexuality. And that, I mean, the main
Right.
Freudo-Marxism, the real manifestation of that was the 1960s movements. And I think,
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but I feel like that was a world historical disaster. I didn't, so I feel like that because it was it was in the guise of a leftist movement. It was an utterly pro-capitalist development of capitalism into all these other cultural areas event. And so I feel like
Yeah.
that to me was the death knell of Freudo-Marxism. And but I do think you're right that some way of thinking together Freud and the critique of capitalism is really and then thinking through an alternative is really the important thing.
Well, putting your thesis that we need to think lack and excess together is a good starting point, and also what I've been attracted to in Alenka's work with What is Sex on the foregrounding the sexual non-relation. That like
Yeah.
that the right response to the 1960s and the right response to sex positivity, and the only way you could socialize the drive is if you think about social relations and drives from the point of view of non-relation. That
Right.
you can never get the full relation, that there's always going to be this constitutive lack. You have to work with it.
Yeah. No, I think that yeah, it's a great point that Alenka raises in that book, and I'm totally agree with that.
So one of the things I guess that might be important for the viewers on this lack excess being intertwined is, and this can just, feed into everything we've discussed so far, is that you seem to link this to the possibilities of egalitarianism. And I know this is a fundamental thing for you politically, and something that appears not just in your work, but in the way you carry yourself as a man, as a professor. Uh, of what do you see as the necessary connection there between egalitarianism, the political possibilities of egalitarianism, and this dialectical unity of lack excess?
Yeah. So I think it's impossible to think any egalitarian behavior or society or politics outside of that link because if you the more and I think this has happened traditionally in society like certain people are excessive as long as others are lacking, right? And I think the the point is, it's only when you see has to be a relation, they have to work together, they have to be tied together. Then if you think of inegalitarian relations as a inegalitarian distribution of excess and lack, then that ceases to be possible, right? So no one then gets by some structural function to occupy a position of more excess than someone else. That we have, as long as we see the connection between them, then ideally, I think this is true. I think someone who really recognizes that would not want to live in a mansion. I firmly think that. I know that's maybe sounds really kind of wildly idealistic, but I think, or like drive a nice car or do all these things that we associate with pure excess. That if you see the connection, you see the way in which, well, the more I have that, the more, well, I'm going to see that someone else is homeless, and I'm not, and I'm going to be in my situation, and that's going to be impossible for me. But I'm also going to see the way in which the more I have, the more rooms I have, the more that I'm actually forcing lack upon myself, right? So so I think that it does, to me, mean a change in not just social structure, but also in behavior. Like if you see that link, then the whole idea of accumulating as much as you can is out the window. It's not part of your way of thinking, and because you think of yourself. And I do think it also, if you I think if I've been in a university for a long time, so I'll be in college meetings and I'll see professors talk who don't think they're lacking, right? And it's obvious, right, that they don't think they're lacking. Unfortunately, when they talk, everyone else recognizes that they're lacking because what they say is typically stupid. But I think it's really important in a classroom to make, in certain ways, evident like your own lack. So to allow challenges, right? To allow yourself to be wrong in a way, like to make evident the ways in which you're wrong, but also to show how even the things that you know are related to your status as a lacking being. Like you don't just know them because whatever. Like everything that I know, I just got because of lack, because I wasn't that good at it. And I really try to underline that point to students, that it's only because Hegel was impossible for me that I became proficient at understanding Hegel, right? It wasn't because I had some preternatural gift for philosophy. It's the opposite. It's because it was really, really hard for me. And that's what drove me to do it. So I think that to me is the biggest thing, is it allows you to comport yourself in an egalitarian way if you grasp that dialectical link.
So about lack and its role in the production of knowledge, talent, skills, whatever, there's a real emphasis in your work about the artist and lack, limitation as key for this other form of subjectivity. And I was wondering, apart from maybe an elaboration for the viewers about how you're thinking about art and its role in capitalism, because this is also something that we've been thinking a lot about at Philosophy Portal with collaborations through Revolt Press, which is a small publishing group that's really thinking about the link between capitalism and aesthetics.
Right.
But also maybe the role of the philosopher, or like we previously talked about, maybe a genuine religious subject, being more focusing on the gap itself than on the full transcendent plenitude. That there's something super important about the cultivation of an artistic or a philosophical or a religious subjectivity that can work with limitation and lack, as opposed to filling it up or obfuscating it.
Right. And I think for me, and it can be as much, it doesn't have to mean you're an artist yourself. It can mean just an appreciation for art, or a way, this famous Nietzsche line, you cited him earlier, I'm going to cite him differently, that turn yourself into a work of art, right? Like that. I think that idea means precisely what you're saying. I love the idea that art has to work with the limit, right? Like it can't, that artistic form is really a question of limits on what the work of art can do. I think I have some mean things to say about free verse in the book. Not as mean as my friend Anna Kornblue, who wrote a whole book, sort of a diatribe against memoir and free verse and that kind of thing. But I think that the limitation of form is really so essential to art, and it makes it makes that relation evident, that the greatness of the artistic excess, because I think we all know artistic works that have this kind of sublimity for us, but it's inextricable to me from the way in which there are certain formal limitations in place in the work of art. I think I give an example from Shakespeare, something Hamlet says, but I think that's really, that's where, so you're right that it's not confined to art. You can think about philosophy that way. You can think about religion that way, for sure. But I like the way that artistic form functions as this limiting thing that's absolutely necessary and yet has a fecundity to it. And I think that's how we should think about lack, that it's limiting because we're lacking beings, but there's a fecundity to that limit that makes us capable of excess at the same time.
Well, in terms of the LAC conference, the history with that, what do you see? Do you see this work as ultimately a result of the things that you've been working on in association with the LAC conference? Where did this book come from, basically?
I worked on this book for a long time, Cadell. So it had I think, so I started out writing a book on freedom, and then I thought, oh, I'm going to have to write about the way in which capitalism hides our freedom from us, right? So about modernity and freedom. And then it turned out that, and I sent it to a friend of mine, and he said, sorry, there's two different books here. There's one book on capitalism and there's another book on freedom. And so I just said, okay, I'll write the freedom book later and I'll just develop the capitalism idea. So that's what it came out of, really about, so it's tied to a lot of things we've been talking about freedom and modernity, but about the initial germ of it was the way in which capitalism functioned as a barrier to the recognition of our freedom in modernity. And then, like kind of how you were saying, it's a kind of return to tradition in a way, in a different form, in an imminent form. And so that's how it developed. So it didn't really, I mean, I think I gave papers from it at LAC, but it wasn't necessarily tied to the LAC. Interestingly, my book on Hegel much more came from the LAC conference. And I wrote a specific thing for that, and that developed in that way, but not this one.
Well, I think the only thing we haven't focused on yet, which I think we should focus on for the context of this book, is the way you're thinking about the relationship between use and uselessness. And again, I recall that your lecture for the Acree course was something like useless excesses. And yeah, how is that functioning for you? Because I think that seems to be really fundamental to your argument, right?
Yeah. So I think one of the ways in which capitalist ideologues justify capitalism is that they say it gives us what we need. It gives us useful things, right? And so I go through a long thing, and I focus on a hammer, basically because I wanted to talk about Martin Heidegger, but I focus on the hammer as what seems like something that's useful, but then the things added to it, which don't help its utility at all, are actually what create its value. So I try to link value to inutility, value to uselessness, and I think that I'm still happy with that. I think that that's right, that the value of a commodity is that the useful part is just the necessary part of it, what Marx would call the necessary part of the commodity. And then the useless part is the surplus. And that's where the surplus value comes in. So I think I'm translating a little bit Marx's notion of surplus value into this framework, but still thinking Marx did not have this theory, because I think I say in the book that he does not have a psychoanalytic understanding. He just thinks of use as if you use it, it's useful, right? So even if it's, I don't know, the white box from that my iPhone comes in, if I end up using it to buy the iPhone, then it's useful. So he doesn't have the same sense of uselessness that psychoanalysis would have, that I have. So which I think causes him to miss the way in which value is inscribed into the commodity, that it's inscribed precisely at the point where there's nothing useful at all about it. And I think if you think about it, I go through this thing. It's why we like buying. We prefer to go buy. I just went and bought a chocolate cake the other day. It was really fun to buy. And at the same time, I bought a bunch of broccoli, and picking out the broccoli was not enjoyable at all for me, but picking out the cake was. So it was Hillary's birthday. It was why I did it. So that I think that's really, to me, that's a really crucial distinction, that the enjoyment factor is the uselessness factor of the commodity.
And I think it's really important for those trying to dedicate their life to art or philosophy or religion or science, is that, and I guess it's the thing that's driven me mad in capitalism, is that it seems like the things I'm most passionate about, the things that keep me up at night, the things that motivate me on a daily basis, that they're useless in a certain way, like that they don't
Right.
have a concrete immediate use value, that in order to connect these works to a use value, there has to be a huge sacrifice, and you can't in advance know what that use might be. I'm just thinking practically about, the things I was passionate about in philosophy and science. There was no, like, there's this meme, a joke was like, oh, you got a philosophy degree, that's great, because there's a new philosophy factory opening up all around, just downtown. There's just a new people actually, my mother would say things like that, because when I was an undergrad, I was studying chimpanzees at first. That was my first thing that I was interested in. And my mom was just like, what are you doing? Like, why are you studying chimpanzees? It's like, it's completely useless. It's like, but it's somehow, somehow keeping that excessive uselessness alive, I think is so fundamental to living a passionate life.
I agree totally. And I think that's part of the reason why capitalism has such a staying power, that it really allows us to mobilize ourselves for what's useless. And I think useless, the way you just put it is exactly right. Like, uselessness is what keeps us alive. It's why we live. I hate the movie Dead Poets Society, but Robin Williams is talking to all the boys, and he says, engineering, architecture, these are very noble professions, but poetry, that's why we live. These other things keep us alive, but poetry is why we. And I thought, that's the only part of the movie I like. I think the rest of it is just terrible. But it's real. I think that's really true, right?
Yeah.
That poetry, or some form of it, like studying chimpanzees, whatever it is, that's what keeps you alive, right? And I think that's really important. And just to bring back to Michael Downs for a minute, like, I think that's what I said to him. Like, you're not doing a theory thing to make money for use to keep you alive. You're doing it because that's what you have to do. Like, and I think that's what the problem is, that capitalism does appeal to that, right? Like, it does have this place for uselessness. And I think there's something really kind of enjoyable about being a stock trader, because you're doing something totally useless for the society. It would function better without you making your little profit in the middle, but it's like, I think you can get off on it. And then of course, the problem is you feel like you always have to do more and more and more and more. And that's a negative, but there's a room for uselessness in it, which is, I think, part of the reason for its success.
No, I mean, and the example of Michael Downs is a perfect one. He, in the same. I guess I have the same experiences, that I can't not philosophize in a way, like it. It just trying to keep that alive. Yeah, and I guess that's the zero level of the tension with capitalism.
It is interesting because I was just going to say, I think it's interesting because parents really care about use. It's funny that you explained your mom was upset, because I think as a parent, I
Yeah.
really care. I really care about the utility. Like, what are you doing that's going to be
Yeah.
useful? That's going to get you a job, and and
Yeah.
but about myself, I don't have that same feeling, right? So it's a very, and
Yeah.
so when I often introduce our film program to incoming prospective students, and to the parents I speak about the utility of the degree and all the internships and all this, but to the students I speak about like the theoretical, how exciting it's going to be theoretically. So it is interesting that I think parents really get caught up in that utility. I just know, even I, as a parent, even though I'm against that way of thinking, I fall for it with my own kids.
Yeah. And I guess I'm gonna have to reflect on it because I'm not a parent yet, but I will be soon. And I think that there's a tension there with being a parent. So you've been a parent for, you know, several decades. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I guess the way I would approach it is that the parent has the dual job of making sure the child has the capacity for an independence when they're, say, 20 or something like that. There's a building
That's
towards,
optimistic.
right, like building towards an, or at least building towards an, that's too optimistic,
Yeah,
but building towards an
yeah,
independence, which requires the emphasis on utility, but also nurturing where the kid is most authentically motivated and
right,
passionate.
right,
and
right,
and those
right.
two things can, now those two things don't necessarily have to be at odds. They can be mutually bootstrapping things, but they often fall into a one-sided contradiction.
Right. But I do think it's an advantage when they coincide. Like, you and I have found places where we can work where they coincide, and that's pretty great.
Yeah, that's the
And
sweet spot.
so people often say to me, like, you don't really have a job. And I just say, yeah, it's kind of
Exactly.
true. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
true.
exactly.
Because
Yeah,
I'm working like 90 hours a week, but doing something that's,
yeah,
it's pretty great. I mean, I'm going to go, when I went to see the movie Relay yesterday, I was doing my job, right? So I
there
was
you
having my
go.
popcorn. I'm working really hard here,
Yeah.
uh, you know. But I mean, not, I actually, seriously, I was analyzing the film, thinking about it theoretically. So
Yeah, yeah.
it is crazy that there are places where you can make them align, but I think most people don't get that. And that's why I think you're right. It's hard being a parent because you have to nurture both things and realize that oftentimes they're going to be at odds with each other. Like my son, who wants to be a doctor, I think he's passionate about being a doctor, but he's also reading War and Peace, and he loves that kind of thing too. So
Right.
he's gonna probably be someone for whom the one side is fulfilled in a different way than the other side is. Whereas my
I've
other
met
son wants to be a writer, and that's going to be probably the same thing.
Well, I've met several people who went to med school and then they dropped out later because their real passion was theology, or their real
Yeah,
passion was war. They wanted to be a literary scholar. You know, that happens all
yeah,
the time. So,
yeah. It does.
um,
It does.
yeah. So I do think that both of us, in terms of our personalities and what we've chosen to done with life, we found that sweet spot, which is, I think, which at the end of the day, when I'm like, again, thinking through what Marx is trying to get at in those early works, it really does seem to be he's trying to get to a place where people can do their self-motivated work, and it's not reduced to need. Like, you need to do
Absolutely.
it,
Right. Right. I think that's true. I think it's true.
Yeah.
I think that's true.
So
Yeah.
anyway, so in terms of Pure Excess as a book as a whole, of course I'll leave a link in the description to Pure Excess if you want to pick up a copy. But is there any final thoughts about the book or the work as a whole that you'd want to leave people with before we close up?
No, I would just say that most of my books that I finish, I hate, and I still don't hate this one yet. So I probably will in some point in time, but I don't hate it yet. So yeah, yeah. I mean, it's interesting.
Is
Yeah.
that the top of the list? Is one of your maybe
Yeah,
your
it's my
favorite?
second favorite. Yeah, the
Second
comedy
favorite?
one, I think it'll always be at the top just because
Okay.
I love comedy, and I feel like that was, yeah, it was like one, I don't think I'll ever have, I think that was my best insight I'll ever have. So, yeah.
Well, Todd, I always appreciate talking to you, and great to always find excuses to talk again. So we'll have to do it again soon. And
Cadell,
again,
anytime.
links in the description to Pure Access. Pick up a copy. It's been Todd McGowan with Cadell Last, and have a great day. Writing for a First Cause, Philosophy Portal's fourth anthology, is now available. To pick up a copy, visit philosophyportal.online.